Hello and welcome. I'm political reporter at The Hill, Julia Manchester, and thank you so much for joining us for today's event, America's Unfinished Business, an LGBTQ+ summit. June is Pride Month, and today we'll be exploring the impacts of hard-fought wins and the road still ahead for some of the issues most affecting the LGBTQ+ communities. Hundreds of anti-LGBT bills are under consideration in state legislatures this year, and at least 17 bills that discriminate against LGBTQ+ communities have been signed into law across 10 states, according to the Human Rights Campaign. Some of these laws include the controversial Florida law prohibiting classroom discussions of sexual orientation or gender identity, or the Alabama law that criminalizes providing gender-affirming medical treatment to trans youth with up to 10 years in prison. In this landscape, what is the outlook for the LGBTQ+ protections at the federal and state levels? How do these laws impact LGBTQ+ people's ability to live their daily lives? And what additional advancements in the visibility and representation should LGBTQ+ people be seeking? We are going to be putting many of these questions and many more in front of our fantastic speakers. But first, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet at us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillLGBTQ. We are broadcasting live, and we will be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience some occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page, in most cases, should fix that problem. And now my first guest is Congressman Mondaire Jones from New York. He co-chairs the Congressional LGBTQ+ Equality Caucus, and he made history alongside his colleague Congressman Richie Torres when he assumed office in January 2021 as one of the first Black, openly gay members of Congress. I recently spoke with him about what he feels are some of the most pressing issues facing the LGBTQ+ communities. Take a listen.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start off with a bit of a news of the day or recent news question. We've heard about this Roe v. Wade potential ruling, the leaked draft memo that showed that the court was poised to overturn Roe v. Wade. And we've heard this talked about so much in the realm of reproductive rights, women's rights and healthcare, and that sort of a thing. However, a lot of LGBTQ+ advocates say that this could impact or set a precedent for members of that community's rights. Wanted to get your take on that.
It is absolutely the case that Justice Alito and the far right 6-3 majority on the court will not stop at taking away abortion rights from millions of Americans. Justice Alito's draft opinion points to decisions that have given fundamental rights to members of the LGBTQ+ community. Marriage equality, for example. The ability to have intimacy, same-sex intimacy, is another such decision. And we know that because of the filibuster and the lack of political courage of a number of my Republican colleagues over the past couple of decades, it has been the Supreme Court of the United States that the LGBTQ community has turned to for the protection and the recognition of its rights. And we are now, unfortunately, seeing that at risk, all that progress at risk of being rolled back because of this 6-3 majority.
All right, and I want to stay on this issue for a minute. You mentioned the filibuster. That's obviously such a hot topic, in previous elections, but this election as well. Can we expect to see members of the LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, the political community in that group really talk about the importance of abolishing the filibuster? Is that an important issue to the community?
Look, it's an important issue to everyday members of the LGBTQ+ community, and certainly to the vast majority of members of Congress, whether the House or the Senate, who are members of the LGBTQ+ community, perhaps with the exception of Kyrsten Sinema. But it remains the case that there are national LGBTQ+ rights organizations that have not yet weighed in support of abolishing or even reforming the filibuster. That is a travesty as I see it. And I would hope that in the days and the weeks to come, we will see these organizations show more political courage in that respect. It is the only thing that we can do in order to then pass on a majority up or down vote bills like the Equality Act, which would finally enshrine protections for the LGBTQ plus community in federal anti-discrimination law.
Right. And speaking of the Equality Act, I mean, could we talk about why it's so important to codify a law like the Equality Act? We know that President Biden has signed an executive order combating gender identity and sexual orientation-based discrimination. But explain to our viewers why the Equality Act, something that has really sat in limbo for years now, why that's so important.
Well, a lot of folks don't realize that under federal law, it is still legal to evict someone from their home because they're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, or discriminate against them in the lending context. We did get a favorable Supreme Court decision a few years ago before the addition of Amy Coney Barrett, and at a time when Justice Kennedy was still on the court, saying that federal law, specifically the Civil Rights Act, should be interpreted to apply to the LGBTQ plus community in the employment context. But this is not how to make public policy, right? Litigation is a terrible way of making public policy. We should have across the board protections for the LGBTQ plus community in federal anti-discrimination law. And we have seen now, especially with the Supreme Court majority rolling back progress for the LGBTQ plus community, that we cannot rely on individual states. There should not be a patchwork system of protections. It should not, fundamental rights should not depend on whether you're in New York versus the state of Mississippi, for example. It is why we need federal protections nationwide that recognize the full humanity of members of the LGBTQ plus community. I'm proud that the Equality Act includes my Juror Non-Discrimination Act, which would protect against discrimination in the jury selection process for LGBTQ plus people.
So we're talking about this distinction between state law and federal law, and we have seen poll after poll showing that more people than really ever before are supporting non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ plus people. Do you think there's a disconnect between what polls are indicating and then what legislation is being passed at the state and federal level?
This is a symptom of our broken democracy. A truly representative government would have resulted in any number of LGBTQ plus rights legislation having been passed at both the federal and the state level. These protections are broadly supported by the American people, regardless of your political affiliation. And yet, because of partisan gerrymandering, whereby elected officials choose their voters instead of voters choosing their representatives, of course, influence of big money in our politics, and sort of structural, institutional, anti-democratic relics like the 60 vote requirement known as the filibuster, Congress is unable to pass on a majority vote legislation that the vast majority of Americans want to see enacted into law if they haven't already assumed that it is law.
Mm-hmm. And, moving on to another issue, we know that violence against members of the LGBTQ plus community, in particular, trans women of color, has really skyrocketed in recent years. Is this an issue that you would like to focus on as a member of Congress? And do you think this is an issue that could be debated in Congress, since it's such a horrible issue that members of the community have had to deal with?
And we have seen violence take place in a number of different contexts, not just physical violence, but policy violence. Mm-hmm. The way that trans individuals are treated in the incarcerated setting, as well as the violence that we see states enact when under law they have codified legislation that would deprive members of the trans community of their full humanity. And so we have to make sure that we are passing, among other things, the Equality Act, which would go a long way in prohibiting that kind of discrimination against trans persons. We also need to look at this question of equity, right? So it's not just enough to have anti-discrimination law. We need to make sure that we are doing things like enacting Medicare for all, which would provide the full panoply of healthcare to every person in America as of right, understanding that trans persons, especially trans persons of color, are disproportionately likely to not have healthcare coverage in America. We also see, relatedly, LGBTQ plus youth experience homelessness, for example, at twice the rate of their cisgendered heterosexual counterparts. So we have to look at equity beyond anti-discrimination law. And that is a perspective that I bring as one of the nation's first openly gay Black members of Congress.
And you bring up such an interesting point about healthcare, because we know that these issues impacting the LGBTQ plus community impact so many other different communities like healthcare. What are some other issues that are very important in this moment to the community right now? And what should we be keeping our eyes out for in terms of what we can see in terms of advocacy?
Well, when I met with the President of the United States in the Roosevelt Room a few months ago, I mentioned to him that student debt cancellation is an issue of LGBTQ plus justice, because members of the LGBTQ plus community are less likely to have the kind of familial supports that other members of our society have. And so they disproportionately experience the crushing student debt that has burdened many millions of Americans to the tune ultimately of $1.7 or so trillion. And so we've got to make sure that we are looking at that. I think the issue of access to PrEP, that life-saving HIV prevention medication, is something that you'll continue to see advocates focus on. It is something that I have led on in the United States Congress. I was proud to lead a letter along with Richie Torres and 70 other members of the House of Representatives to the CDC and to CMS saying, hey, there's this new drug. It's an injectable form of PrEP called Apretude, and it's actually more effective than the pill form of PrEP. And in the same way that you did for the pill form of PrEP, we are asking for you to require insurance companies to cover Apretude, the injectable form of PrEP, at no cost at all to patients. So eliminate that cost sharing requirement. This is a life-saving, transformative medication, and it would go a long way towards ending the disproportionate crisis of HIV/AIDS in queer communities of color in particular.
We only have about a minute left, but you and Congressman Torres became the first openly gay Black members of Congress in January of 2021. The country is getting more diverse. Congress is getting more diverse. Do you think we will ever get to a point where the idea of being first is no longer really an idea, that we will get to the point where diversity in these institutions like Congress is simply normal?
And of course, diversity simply means full representation of this beautifully diverse country. So I think we will get to that point, but only if we fight for it. We've got a number of members of the LGBTQ plus community who are at risk, for example, of losing their seats in Congress. And there are only 9 of us in the House of Representatives to begin with, of the 435, and of course, only 2 in the Senate. So we've got a long way to go. The progress must be fought for and protected. That is my commitment, and I know that that is the commitment of my colleagues.
Congressman Jones, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thanks again to Congressman Mondaire Jones. For our next conversation, we'll take a closer look at some of the bills most impacting the LGBTQ community across the country. I now turn to my colleague Ron Corning, who's a contributor for TV station CW33 out of Dallas, Texas. He recently spoke with Kevin Jennings, CEO of Lambda Legal, the oldest, largest national legal organization whose mission is to achieve recognition of civil rights of lesbians, gay men, bisexual, transgender people, and everyone living with HIV. Let's hear their conversation.
Kevin, thank you for joining us and being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Ron, for having me on.
And I do want to make sure that we address during the course of our conversation the breadth and depth of all the work Lambda Legal has done since 1973. But let's start, if we can, with what's top of mind right now, and that is the safety of our children in schools. We've seen overt acts of gun violence, most recently Uvalde, Texas, right here in my home state. But you're working another fight for the long-term well-being of children, and that is to feel loved and included and part of the community when they head off to school. Legislation in various states seem to be working against that. Where are you with that?
First of all, this speaks to me, both the Uvalde tragedy and the attacks on LGBTQ plus youth, very personally. I was a high school teacher for 10 years. And during those years, I helped students start the first gay straight alliance in the country in 1988. The fact is, schools remain unsafe on many levels, particularly for LGBTQ plus youth, who are much more likely to report that they've skipped school because they don't feel safe there, who are up to 4 times more likely to report they've attempted suicide, and who are, quite honestly, at risk every day in our schools. This is not getting better thanks to state legislatures around the country. This year, over 300 anti-LGBTQ plus bills have been introduced into state legislatures around the country, some of them so-called don't say gay or trans laws, which would prohibit the discussion of issues of sexual orientation and gender identity in our classes. All this does is make LGBTQ plus students who are already vulnerable feel more marginalized and more isolated, and it's directly responsible for causing a higher rate of suicide, a higher rate of dropout, a higher rate of substance abuse, and it's completely unconscionable to see legislators playing with the lives of LGBTQ plus young people to win a few political points.
Well, I was going to say in framing it the way you did and in talking about what this means long term, we begin to see during those formative years when a child really needs love and acceptance in order to deal with just, the growing pains of childhood. Are we not setting up otherwise incredibly productive and bright young people to have a future that's laden with a range of social issues, interpersonal social issues, and not feeling like they can succeed really anywhere?
Absolutely. When I was a teacher, I had a student approach me who was gay and tell me he was thinking of killing himself. In the discussion, he said to me, "Why shouldn't I do it? My life isn't worth saving anyway." The reality is, when we pass these hateful laws, when we tolerate bullying and harassment, we are teaching young people that their lives are not worth saving anyway. We are directly responsible for the crisis that LGBTQ plus youth are facing right now with the increased rates of suicide, dropout, and substance abuse. It's a logical reaction to being taught every day that your life is literally worth less because of who you are.
It's interesting because a tenet of conservatism is personal freedom, and yet many of these bills seem to be moving in the direction of taking away personal freedom in terms of how someone identifies. Where's that disconnect? And another part of that same question is many of these legislators, regardless of party affiliation, regardless of their religious faith, have in their own families come to terms with someone who may be gay or lesbian, bisexual, transgender. I thought we were getting to a place where, as they say, it's harder to hate the closer you are. This seems to be counterintuitive to that. How do you wrap your head around it?
Well, I think it's one word: politics. If people think they can win political points out of marginalizing someone, they will do it. And throughout history, we have stereotyped minorities as being threats to children. Supposedly, Jews drank the blood of Christian children, and that justified pogroms and the Holocaust. Supposedly, Black men went after little white girls. That justified lynching. Supposedly, LGBTQ plus people recruit or groom children. That justifies the kinds of actions we're seeing right now. It is all politics, and that makes it, to me, especially despicable because some of these legislators actually have LGBTQ plus people in their lives, and they know better. So that makes it really disappointing that they would utilize LGBTQ plus people as political pawns to win a few cheap points.
So in your experience, I could share my own experience, but in your experience, are there legislators who you believe personally don't believe legislation they're backing, but rather their political careers are depending on passing this legislation, as you say, to score political points with their constituency?
Absolutely. When I was Assistant Secretary of Education for President Obama, we had a program called Race to the Top. It seems like we have a new program in America called Race to the Bottom. And we're seeing states trying to outdo each other in the level of hateful and ignorant legislation they're passing. The fact of the matter is the overwhelming majority of Americans know someone who's LGBTQ plus. They know better than this. And what's happening here is we're seeing people being asked to give into their basest fears, their basest prejudices. And I thought our leaders were supposed to ask us to be better than who we are, not worse.
So what happens next? Because this isn't the only legal battle that you'll wage. And I'm curious to know, what is the legal path forward? Is there a way to block this legislation? Or is this born out of individual cases and people that you'll represent in situations where they're challenging the law on the state level and it gets appealed up to the level of the Supreme Court? Or is it a multitude of ways in which these issues might come to fruition legally?
It's a multitude of ways. The fact is, we are on the ground in multiple states fighting these laws. In West Virginia, for example, there was a ban passed on trans young people participating in school sports. We went to court on behalf of Becky Pepper Jackson, an 11-year-old middle school student who just wanted to run on her middle school cross-country team, and the courts agreed with us. And this year, Becky was able to run on her middle school cross-country team. We're in court in Tennessee, where Luke Esquivel is a 14-year-old high school freshman. All he wants is to play on his high school golf team, and that case is pending. We're in court in Texas, where the governor is suggesting that the children who are trans, whose parents are supporting them and getting them the medical care they need, be taken away from their parents, and that this be classified as child abuse. We have blocked that in court. The fact is, Lambda Legal is the LGBTQ plus community's last line of defense. Unfortunately, due to the cynical politics that take place in many state legislatures, we don't have the votes to stop these laws from being passed, which means it comes down to Lambda Legal to get them struck down in court. And I promise you this, we will keep fighting until every one of these laws is declared unconstitutional, which they all are.
Yeah. Do you feel like the legacy of the work you've done since 1973, being the largest and the oldest national legal organization with a mission to bring equality to bear in this country, do you feel like that legacy is what propels you forward in many ways?
Absolutely. Well, on the personal level, I think back to my student in 1988 who wanted to take his own life. And I made myself a promise that I would spend the rest of my life fighting to make sure no LGBTQ plus young person ever felt that way again. On an institutional level, virtually every major advance for LGBTQ plus people in this country, including the right of students not to be bullied and harassed in school, which Lambda Legal won in 1996 in the Busney versus Podlesny. The rights of students to have gay-straight alliances in their schools, which Lambda won in 2000 in Killeen versus Orange County Unified. All of these are now at risk due to a concerted attack to roll back these advances that we have won over the last 49 years. We have not spent the last half a century fighting to make our kids safer to let them take it away from us now.
I gather from that you are concerned that both the composition and the disposition of the Supreme Court and the signal to roll back Roe versus Wade, does that leave you concerned that the Supreme Court will take steps to, again, reverse, roll back what have been seemingly advances toward equality for the LGBTQ plus community?
You know, the bad thing about Lambda Legal's work is that it's litigation, and litigation can be overturned, as we're about to see in the cases of Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision out of Mississippi. So the thing about that ruling, if indeed it follows the leaked opinion by Justice Alito, is it says that essentially there is no right to privacy. Well, the right to privacy was fundamental to Lambda Legal's Supreme Court victory in 2003, Lawrence versus Texas, which ended laws that criminalized same-sex relationships, and our 2015 victory, Obergefell versus Hodges, which made marriage equality the law of the land. If there is indeed no right to privacy, those decisions are now at risk. So yes, we are deeply concerned.
Well, it's interesting because you know the studies as well as I do. 80% of people surveyed, regardless of their religious or party affiliation, they want equal rights for the LGBTQ plus community. In this state of Texas, I live in Dallas. I know what the general disposition of this county and this city are. And in other, not just metropolitan areas, but rural areas as well. It seems to be consistent that people are moving more toward wanting equality. And yet, this is a state at the center of some of this legislation, some of this rhetoric as well, even if it doesn't come to legislation. I guess my question for you on that point is, are we dealing with a small but incredibly vocal minority, or are we dealing with a real challenge to the foundation of equality?
I think we're dealing with a real challenge. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. The majority of Americans also favor access to abortion. but we're maybe about to see that overturned at the Supreme Court this month. So a small determined minority can indeed reverse progress in this country. It has happened before, and it could happen again. In the late 1800s, the Supreme Court, after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1860s and 70s, vitiated them with the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, which said that segregation was okay. So we've seen where there's been advances in civil rights in America, and the courts have reversed those advances. It has happened before, and I'm deeply concerned that it is about to happen again.
I want to try to end here, if we can, Kevin, on a positive note, because your job is really to look at what the challenges and what the hurdles are. But I know you stand back and take a 30,000-foot view. The motto there behind you speaks to that. We're here and we're just getting started. So you're not giving up. You're not giving in. How would you rank your optimism today compared to 10 years ago in terms of where we are?
First of all, I'm a fundamentally optimistic person because I think Americans are at their heart people who believe in fairness and justice. And I believe that in the end, fairness and justice will carry the day. I don't know that I'm as optimistic as I was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were building momentum towards marriage equality, and it indeed seemed that the tide was running in favor of greater equality. Now we're looking at a situation where we're seeing rights overturned in the courts. We're seeing hundreds of anti-LGBTQ plus bills being presented in state legislatures. I would say that while I'm a fundamentally optimistic person, I'm concerned at the trend I'm seeing now. The trend 10 years ago seemed to be towards greater equality. There now seems to be a growing and powerful backlash to the victories we have won. And I'm very concerned that we could be going into a period where we actually see things go backwards for a while.
Well, I appreciate your honesty, and I hope if it does nothing else, it allows for people as they celebrate this month, the milestones that have been met, they also are aware of the challenges that lie ahead. And you are a great resource for people to get some context and perspective on that. And we appreciate you being part of this conversation today, Kevin.
Well, thank you. My message for Pride Month comes from the great gay artist Andy Warhol, who once said, people will tell you that time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself. If you want America to be a better place, go out and change it yourself.
Great final word, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Kevin Jennings, CEO of Lambda Legal, and my colleague Ron Corning. Although the Supreme Court ruled in a landmark decision that prevented employers from terminating LGBTQ identifying employees on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, there is still work to be done to reach full inclusion in the workplace. To discuss this, I'm now joined by Aaron Uritis, CEO of Out and Equal, a nonprofit organization dedicated to achieving full workplace equality for LGBTQ plus people. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Aaron, just to start off with, I have this some stats in front of me. A 2021 survey by the Williams Institute found that 1 in 10 LGBTQ workers experienced discrimination at work in the last year. LGBTQ employees of color were more likely to report being denied jobs and to experience verbal harassment. How does training like what you do at Out and Equal help solve and alleviate these situations?
Great question. And I think we're attacking it from many fronts, and companies are really right alongside us in doing so. I mean, at a fundamental level, training provides people with the language and the concepts and the knowledge of how our community is evolving, and that's really important. I think second, we are seeing companies engage with organizations like us to focus on agency and allyship, right? So that the trainings include real suggestions, real life examples, and again, the language so that people can stand up for each other as allies. And third is, I think, even more specifically on the second point, or to draw that out a little bit, is how to make change within your organization. So it's connecting employees who go through training with the employee resource groups, for example, who are an employee engagement mechanism where they can be agents of change on the job.
Could you give us a snapshot of how corporate America and what corporate America is doing to really achieve true equality? And what grade would you give them overall on equality in the workplace when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community?
I think it's tough to give a grade, but I think I'll step back and just give you some context that, listen, I think we've made extremely big strides in the last 20, 25 years. Even when we started, Julia, 20 years ago, more than 22 years ago, less than 4% of Fortune 500 companies had any protection for the LGBTQ community. So, I think that when you look at, I'm encouraged by progress that I see when you look at indices like HRC's Corporate Equality Index, and you see how many more companies continue to reach for that bar every year and have inclusive policies and benefits. That is in itself encouraging. I think your previous guests have talked a lot about the cultural and political backlash right now, the challenges that exist, and those are real. At the same time, corporate America, organizations at large, I think, have also really strengthened their muscle and their voice as the years have progressed to become voices for the kind of employees that work for them, which is a diverse set of employees, and are really standing up for what is best for business. And so, bottom line, I think there's still work to go, right? There's still progress to be made. Companies still need to do work on the basics if they haven't looked at their benefits and their policies, how they spend money on their LGBTQ employee resource groups. But at the same time, we need, for all the reasons that your guests have said before me, we really need to solidify our voice. We need to think about reaching out across movements and joining in solidarity for essentially as a workplace where everybody feels like they belong.
Right. And a key phrase you used there was what's best for business. Obviously, any workplace should be striving and achieving true equality among all of its employees. But, what's the business case for LGBTQ plus inclusion? How does this ultimately benefit businesses? I know it seems like an obvious question, but I don't think we're at the point where we should be yet with inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah, so listen, there's a lot of research that's been done already that shows that workplaces where people feel they can be authentically themselves out and themselves, whatever kind of identity and background they come from, are more productive, effective, creative, right? And that the bottom line for businesses is better. It's why when we were in front of the Supreme Court a couple of years ago for this monumental case, that more than 215 businesses signed on to an amicus brief saying that this is simply bad for business, is that if we do not protect workers' rights. Yeah, I mean, the business case, it is very strong. I would also tell you that as more and more people come out, and especially at younger generations, so even between millennials and Gen Z, Julia, there is an explosion of kids identifying as LGBTQ, and that should grab the attention of businesses if their current state and how they're currently addressing their customers, employees, has not captured their attention yet. Because the more these kids and future talent are coming into their workplaces, the bigger of an issue it's going to be. And so we are encouraging everybody to jump on this train now. And there's lots of support to do so. This work is not easy, but it is going to be better for their business if they focus on this.
So, do most companies and businesses already have non-discrimination policies and protections in place? And really, is there any sort of gap between protections in companies' books and workers' abilities to actually, be their authentic selves at work?
I love this question because there's two parts to this. One is that more and more companies, as I mentioned, have policies, better benefits on the books. But I think that, again, if these things exist, but people can still not come out at work, or they still feel like they cannot be their true selves in meetings and with their colleagues, it doesn't much matter. I mean, it doesn't matter completely to their work experience. And so this is really the second part of the question, which is, this idea that people have heard about time and time again, it's really gained traction in popular culture, is this idea of belonging, right? But belonging is not just this it shouldn't just be this kind of soft term that remains undefined. For us, and it's why we have a tagline called the business of belonging, is that this is really hard work, complicated. It is also a journey, but that it is really working towards optimal organizational culture. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And so are there gaps? Yes, the gaps are between, for those that have the policy and benefits, and really optimal cultures. And that is, there's a lot of work to do there. But again, I think companies get it and they're really working towards it.
So we've talked about, general equality in the workplace among employees in general. But what about in leadership? Do you think there's an appetite in corporate America for LGBTQ leadership at the top of many of these major companies and corporations?
I just love that we're actually having this question now, right? The question itself shows how far we've come. I mean, listen, there's an appetite for it because the more people are out and in the workplace and growing in the ranks, the more you see people like Tim Cook and Tim Federling from Dow out, Beth Ford, for example. Visibility, the more visibility will attract more people coming out. And so, I think there's not just an appetite for it. I think there's a real resonance within the workplace because people are coming out as themselves and they're telling their stories, and those stories cut across identities. And again, in the spirit of authenticity and why authenticity is so important to workplace culture, I think there's a huge, not just appetite, but resonance for not just employees, but for customers as well.
Right. And, in terms of people of color, when we talk about intersectionality within the LGBTQ plus community, people of color, women and trans people are more likely to experience loneliness in their workplace. And I'm sure I can imagine that's a very lonely place to be. How can that ultimately impact performance, and how can companies create an environment where they feel welcome, where they feel like there is a community that may not necessarily understand what they go through day to day, but has their back?
Gosh, I mean, from a tactical level, there's just so many things, but again, not easy because it's this holy grail of good organizational culture, right? I mean, people, first of all, we need more of everybody, of every different kinds of people in the workplace. So efforts on talent, recruitment, retention for specific groups so that you don't lose people, that you don't lose the visibility of those people as they gain traction in their organizations. I think that's really important. Supporting and funding actually these employee resource groups as mechanisms where people of certain identities can find each other, right? And that the company supports employees in their engagement in these mechanisms. There are LGBTQ ERGs are only one of probably about 15 or 20 kinds. So there are ERGs for people of color, for women, for vets, for mental health right now. And these are really, we call them belonging accelerators, Julia, because they're just such a great way to get people engaged, to get people building relationships, which, by the way, is good for business, on the work front. And so those are just a few things that I think companies can do.
Erin, thank you so much for your time on this very important topic. I mean, as someone who considers themselves an ally to the LGBTQ plus community, it's been amazing to see the growth in corporations and other sectors and groups around the country when it comes to LGBTQ plus involvement. So we really appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Erin Uritas, CEO of Out and Equal. Workplace equality is not just limited to corporate spaces. Some critics of what has been called the Don't Say Gay bill in states like Florida argue that these laws are creating unequal workplaces for educators and school employers and impacting students and young people in the process. Joining me now to discuss how laws like this impact the classroom is Corey Bernhardt, an openly gay kindergarten teacher in Parrish, Florida. Thank you so much for joining me, Corey.
Thanks, Julia, for having me. Excited to be here.
Oh, well, we're excited to have you. Corey, I know that you've become, you've made a lot of media appearances lately, as we've seen Florida, and just full disclosure, I'm a native of Orlando, Florida, in the news with the Don't Say Gay bill, or as supporters of the bill would call the Parental Rights and Education Act. Tell us about, your story and how you've got involved in activism and speaking out against this legislation, or I guess now law.
Absolutely. Well, I first just want to thank you, Julia, and the Hill for putting on this summit and really, putting these issues to the forefront of the news, because it's very important, and we need to keep talking about it and keep moving forward. So, really just to start, as this bill was really coming in out of Tallahassee, it created a lot of buzz within, the school communities and with teachers and with teacher organizations. And I was reached out by a local news network in Tampa. They wanted to do a little story and just how it would affect me personally and professionally as a gay kindergarten teacher. And from there, it really just kind of took off. After that story aired, John Oliver picked up and did a little bit on it, and then MSNBC picked up and wanted me to be part of one of their live shows and their discussions. And from there, just kept on building and building, and until I'm here today. And I've also done an op-ed with NBC, and just really just speaking out and trying to tell my story and how I'm affected personally. As a professional, but as an individual.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, could you share a little more about how you're impacted professionally and personally by this law?
Absolutely. One of the very first things that you see when you walk in to my classroom or walk to my classroom is there's a plaque right outside my room, and it has pictures of me and my family, because at my school, our motto is family, memories, passion. We create family, but we share our family. We create memories, but we also share memories, and we're creating passion, but we share our passions. And my family is represented outside of my classroom. My family looks a little bit different than heterosexual families. This bill really makes me feel like it's not okay for me to be represented in the way that I should be represented. So I immediately was questioning myself. Am I allowed to have these pictures hanging up outside in my room? Because my students then ask me, well, Mr. Bernard, who is that with you in your picture outside in the classroom? And I say, well, that's my partner, Jeremiah. And they say, well, what does that mean? What does partner mean? And then we go into these discussions, and because that is my family, and it wouldn't be any different than a heterosexual man walking into his classroom with a picture of his wife and a student asking them about their their family was, and they say, well, that's my wife, or that's my girlfriend, or that's my partner. But because this is a gay issue, it does make me very worried to what could happen. What legal rights do parents now have if they feel that I am instructing or having discussions with their child about sexual orientation or gender identity, or even my students? This past year, I had a little girl with two moms, and she doesn't know any better. That is her family to her. So when she talks to her kids about her two moms, and then the kids come to me and say, Mr. Bernard, did you know that she's got two moms? Well, how can she have two moms? Am I allowed to say, well, some families look a little bit different than yours. They might have two moms, and if I have a child, my child will have two dads. Is that allowed? Am I allowed to say that? And I should be able to speak freely about my family. She should be able to speak freely about her family. So that's just the surface of the fears that we're dealing with this bill.
Right. Lori, in talking to supporters of the bill, they essentially say, look, this isn't about preventing someone from talking about their family. It's preventing having, conversations about sex in the classroom or inappropriate material. What do you say to that? Because it seems like, there's two completely different stories coming out here, and people like yourself feel that they can't be their genuine selves in their own classroom with their own family.
Yeah, you're right. And to add to that, I will say that after my MSNBC interview, the headlines that were coming out on some of these very right-wing social media accounts and news outlets were, kindergarten teacher upset that he can't talk to his kindergartners about his sex life. And that's not what this is about at all. The fact that they think that we are talking about sex with our school-age children, it is actually very, very hurtful, and it really puts a misunderstanding in them that they don't even understand that we are professionals. We we teach to a high degree of standard. We have standards to teach. Our standards do not say that we are going to talk to our kids about sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. We don't teach or instruct those things. However, discussion, that is a part of teaching, and we do discuss things to enhance the standards that we are teaching. So for them to say that this is about sex is completely wrong. It's completely false. And what I say to that is this is about families, and it's about love for families.
Absolutely. And love for families and love in general is something we really need more now in this world. With the Florida connection we have here, growing up in Orlando, and, I always notice the city's, vibrant LGBTQ plus community. And I know that extends across or up and down Florida, I should say. It's a pretty long state.
It is.
Would love to get your take on the state's LGBTQ plus community in general. We hear so much about, the other side of this, but talk about how that community has supported you. I mean, I see so many stories from back home that are so heartening, stories of, family and community, and I would just love to get your take.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important part to bring into this too is, the ones that are making a lot of noise and the ones that are loud, they are few and far between, but they are loud and they are negatively loud. However, just to your point, the surrounding communities and the LGBT community has really stood behind me, patted me on the back, lifted me up, messages, text messages, Facebook messages, Instagram messages, Twitter. I mean, letters in the mail. I've had donations from my classroom. I mean, that outpouring of support has been really, really encouraging. Most importantly, my school community, who truly knows me for the educator that I am, the professional that I am, the give 150% to my students person that I am, they have been 110% behind me. My administrators have been behind me. They know who I am as a person and as an educator. And so there has been no question that they have put their right foot forward for me because they know who I am. And I think that that's also one of the things that we have to remember is, behind all of this, we are still teachers who are working so hard every day that for one more thing for us to have a spotlight on is the last thing that we need. We need to be lifting up our educators, especially during this time. And when we throw these bills in here like this, what you guys are doing and what the community is doing to rally around LGBTQ plus teachers is so important, and we feel it. We really do.
Corey, I could talk to you for hours about this, but unfortunately we have to leave it here. But thank you so much for your time on this and for sharing your story. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Julia. Again, I appreciate you guys making this a forefront issue. And as I say, let's keep fighting the good fight.
Of course. Well, thanks again to Corey Barnard. This year, at least 7 states have signed transgender athlete bans into law. To discuss the impacts of these bills and more, I recently spoke with Cece Telfler, who made history as the first openly trans woman to win an NCAA national title when she won the Division II 400-meter hurdles event in 2019. Let's listen to our conversation.
Cece, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. I want to start out with some of the legislation that's been in the works at the federal level and at the state level targeting transgender students in sports. So far in 2022, at least 7 bills have been passed targeting transgender students' participation in sports, according to the Human Rights Campaign. What do you want the government and our audience really to understand about how these issues are impacting trans people?
First of all, Julia, thank you so much for having me. And what I want the audience to understand is that these bills not only impact, but it hurts and it sets the country back. So if we're trying to move forward, there's no moving forward with these bills being so prevalent in Congress and like coming into play and passing. It's going to put the country like 5 steps back instead of moving forward and progressing. And it's hurting human beings and it's preventing us and taking away basic human rights. So that's what these bills are literally doing.
And I imagine that, for someone who is a part of the trans community, watching the coverage of these bills, seeing the rhetoric around this legislation, there's got to be a negative mental health impact. So what are the mental health impacts on trans youth who are being targeted by these bills and may not be allowed to play on teams aligning with their identity?
Absolutely. So some of the negative impacts that these bills have is that we use sports as a way to escape, as a way to cope. So taking away these coping mechanisms can lead us to doing other things, going to drugs or getting involved in the wrong crowd. Also, it can lead us to, taking our lives, because sports is a way of like how we save ourselves. It's where we escape. It's where we get out all our frustrations, it's how we get out all the bad thoughts, right? So if we take away a way for us to cope and a way for us to, in a healthy way to handle our issues, it's detrimental and it can cost us our lives.
And speaking to conservatives and Republicans who are, advocating for this legislation, they say this is all about fairness in sports. It's nothing personal. It's just they want to make sure that girls on a team or boys on a team are being treated fairly. You're an athlete. You've been in competitions on the world stage. What's your response to that?
Response to that is that they're absolutely correct. Girls are girls and boys are girls. Boys are boys. So I'm a female athlete, so I compete in female sports. You know what I mean? So we are, the trans aspect of it is just used to define something that people cannot understand. However, at the end of the day, we are women. We are female athletes as well, and we should be treated and seen as such.
And you were deemed ineligible to compete in the U.S. Olympic trials in June 2021. Are you still training for any future Olympics? And, what do you think we can, people can do to ensure a more inclusive Team USA?
Absolutely. So I am, can't stop, won't stop. I'm going to keep going. There's always going to be bridges to break you down, but getting up is the hardest part. So I'm standing up and I'm going to keep going in the direction that I'm going. And in order for Team USA to have a more inclusive environment is first, they have to see athletes like myself. They have to not only see us, but embrace us as well as such and support us without compromise, because athletes are honestly the future, and the respect that athletes get if there is an inclusive diverse and equal environment for athletes to compete and be themselves, then the future and the younger generation coming up will see that. And that's what we should aim to do.
And we're talking about the future, but, obviously it seems like there's been a lot of progress made in this arena, no pun intended, in recent years. Could you talk about the progress and, if you think there's even been enough progress, or is this sort of a thing that's a kind of movement that's going to take time?
I definitely feel as though that the progress that was being made has definitely gotten pushed back because of these bills that are arising. So as far as that goes, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of energy and putting a lot of time into, creating that progress. And like I said before, in order for us to do that, they have to see us as the athletes, as the female and males that we are too, because we are trying so hard to be a part of a group that is denying us. So for that group to see us, then other people will see us too. So it's all about like embracing us as athletes and embracing us as the women that we are, or the men that we are.
And, as a trans athlete, do you feel that you have a support system, not only within the trans community and the broader LGBTQ community, but do you feel like there's a system right now that has your back and you feel supported to really keep going? And how can we ensure that future trans athletes get that support system?
I absolutely feel like the support system is coming up. Like major countries, like major organizations such as like Michelob Ultra, seeing us and incorporating us in commercials with other female athletes, saying, "Hey, we see you. You are a female athlete as well." Like it takes courage like that to, and not only like did they see us, they're donating $100 million to women's sports over the next 5 years, and that's what it takes. They're not only incorporating us in that category of female athletes as women, but also showing that there are unequal and there are biases within the gender spectrum of the community of male and female athletes, because female athletes don't get the same resources, we don't get the same support, we don't get the same help as male athletes. So that just boosts that exposure and that, that support that we need in order to thrive and be the best that we can possibly be.
Right. And we've talked about the government and, the state legislatures, federal legislatures' roles in these bills and the policy making surrounding the issue. But, I know that corporations have recently been in the news, becoming, or at least from my vantage point, would love to hear from you, becoming more inclusive and accepting of the trans community. Do you see that happening in the private sector?
Personally speaking, I start to see more because there are individuals that are being elected right now that are trans folks, and it's awesome to see that, because it's good to see we have somebody like us that is in the government system, on that stage, in that sector, and that's a start. Honestly, that's a start. But as far as progressiveness that we're speaking about, it's going to take time.
Mm-hmm. Right. And finally, I would love to hear some advice you'd have for younger trans athletes who are really navigating this political and cultural environment right now. What would you tell them to, keep going and pursuing their dreams in sports?
Absolutely. So my advice to younger trans athletes and non-binary athletes is never stop seeking your purpose, keep being determined, keep working hard, and never stop fighting, because everything will be okay, and I'm on your side, and I see you, and I hear you, and everything will be okay. Just keep going, keep pushing, and fight on.
Cece, it's such an important issue, and it's obviously playing a huge role in our political discourse. So we thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Absolutely, Julia. Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks so much again to Cece Telfer for joining us. My final guest is New York Times best-selling author Casey Mcquisten, whose novels include the LGBTQ romantic comedies Red, White, and Royal Blue. That's one that's on my list to read. One Last Stop, and their latest release, I Kissed Shara Wheeler. Excuse me. Welcome, Casey. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, well, we're so excited to have you. Like I said before, you've written 3 LGBTQ inclusive angles and stories. What is the feedback you've gotten from these books? I know that this representation hasn't existed in novels or books in general before, back in history, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing I hear from readers is just how exciting it is to walk into a bookstore and see a book on a shelf that you can relate to, that features people in relationships like yours, with friends like yours, having experiences that you can relate to, especially for a lot of romance readers, because it is such a personal genre, and it's a genre that is so based in feelings. Like being able to relate to those feelings on such a deep and intrinsic and sort of fluent queer level, I think means a lot to a lot of readers who haven't been able to find that as easily before.
And, speaking of the inclusion of LGBTQ characters, people, content in these stories, how has that evolved in literature? I mean, it seems to me, and granted, I could have missed this before, but, I haven't really noticed these characters, this content, these stories until, probably within the last 10 years. I mean, tell us about how that's evolved and what your experience has been like being in that evolution.
Yeah, I think that those stories did exist, but they were so hard to find. Often they were not very accessible. They were, indie published, very small runs, like from small presses, or they were only ebook, and you had to know somebody who knew something about the stuff to be able to find it. When I was growing up, I grew up in Southern Louisiana, and I didn't have a local indie, and what I had access to was what was sold at Walmart or Books A Million, and so, you get what you get. And it's been incredible to watch, especially, I would say even in the last 5 years, it has really, really accelerated the amount of books that you can walk into like a major retailer and just see them on an end cap display, see them on a Pride table. And it's so exciting for me, both as a queer person and a queer writer, to know that there's not going to be a kid who is walking through a bookstore lost the way that I did, just like wondering, where on earth do I find a book that can show me, a queer story that has a happy ending? I think that it's the trajectory is moving in the right direction, but we still have a lot of ground to cover in terms of diversifying what is on the shelves. I would love to see an even broader range of queer fiction. I would love to see shelves just overflowing with queer romance and trans romance, which we don't have nearly enough of. So an incredible acceleration and accessibility for these books, but also makes me very excited about what more there is to come.
Earlier in the program, I was talking to Corey Barnard. He's a kindergarten teacher in Florida. He's openly gay, and he's really been impacted by the Don't Say Gay bill, or parental rights in education legislation that's now law in that state. And it seems like recently there's really been a push to crack down on or censor a lot of LGBTQ plus materials in classrooms. Are you at all concerned that that could go beyond classrooms and enter realms like bookstores? Or do you think that this is a culture war that's really been sequestered to the education space?
Oh, that's a good question. I loved the interview with Corey, by the way, I was watching. I'm definitely concerned about what's going on in educational spaces. I've done this past year a lot of conferences, meeting with educators and librarians who are, kind of our frontline defense in this fight. And they are tired, and they are being harassed every day, especially in red states or conservative areas. But really, honestly, it could be any school district in America. Somebody is calling and harassing a librarian somewhere. And it's definitely concerning. I think about how many teen readers I've interacted with who have come to me with such genuine emotion of just how deeply it has changed their ability to have hope for their future, to see a queer story that is joyful and escapist and has a happy ending in fiction, whether it's my book or another book. I really can't overstate how much it means to these kids to have that representation. When you're that age, sometimes escaping into fiction is like a lifesaver. And so that's, not only am I worried about those kids losing access, but I'm also worried about what kind of messaging they're internalizing from their parents, calling their school and saying, this is not fit for my kid to read, when it's depicting what that kid is, so that's a huge concern for me. But I think as far as retailers go, I'm not as concerned on that front now. I think it's definitely a scary time to be any type of queer person in America. But somebody who's writing queer books right now, you do have to kind of constantly check the temperature of the water, and the louder the backlash gets, the more those corporate interests are feeling a little threatened. They're like, oh, is the wind changing, or do we need to like pull back to preserve our profits? So that's always scary. And that's always something that we, I think, have in mind as queer writers. But I also think that the major retailers are out here putting out books, and they want books that sell, and they want books that make readers excited and engaged. And I think that queer books are doing that right now for them.
Right. And I mean, we talk about the retailers, but do you see that with publishers as well? I mean, we see that more children and more people in general are, seem to be feeling more comfortable to come out and live their authentic lives, be their authentic selves. So I would imagine that publishers, it would behoove of them to publish books that are appealing to their audience.
Yeah, no, and I think publishers know that, and I think it started in YA really, and we're seeing it really spill over into adult romance now. With the last few years, this wave of queer adult romance books coming out from the big five, kind of those big name publishers that everyone knows of, like what we call big five publishers. And I also know so many people on so many levels of the publishing industry who are queer and trans folks who are really, really deeply invested in championing those stories. And those are the ones who are really advocating for those stories and convincing people that it's more than just a bottom line. It's also, this is why we're here. Aren't we here to tell stories that matter? Aren't we here to tell stories that can make somebody's life better or even save somebody's life? And those people are doing hard work to advocate for stories by people like me, which shout out to those people. They're amazing.
And Casey, before I let you go, I'm sure there are many young LGBTQ plus writers or aspiring writers who are looking up to you right now and who would love to follow in your path. What's one piece of advice you would like to give them?
Oh, wow. I mean, I have, can I do two? Is that cheating?
Of course. No, please do.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I feel like I say to every young person who comes through one of my signing lines is I like to tell them, like, you are okay, like you are good. And not in the sense of like, you're going to be okay, but in the sense of like, there is nothing wrong with you. You have nothing to apologize for being who and what you are exactly and unapologetically. And no matter what kind of environment you're in or who's trying to make you feel any type of way about that part of you, that is the coolest and most brave and vibrant part of you. And it's going to be the thing that takes you farthest in life, no matter how scary it feels right now. So I say that to all queer young people, because I think that's important to hear. And I needed to hear it when I was that age. Specifically for queer writers, don't be afraid to take risks. I mean, when I wrote Red, White, and Royal Blue, my first book, it was, 2016, and there were not really a lot of mainstream, traditionally published queer romantic comedies for adults, and I sent it out to agents, and people were like, oh, we don't know about this. But I bet on it, and I found people who were willing to bet on it, and I went in with my whole heart, and I think that was what took it to where it ended up going. And it's really scary to come out as a queer person and to do work from your queer heart and hope that the world's going to be ready for it. But when you put your whole queer heart into it, I really do believe, not to sound a little too Pollyanna here, but I do believe that comes through in the work, and it's infectious, and it brings more and more people in to advocate that work and get it where you want it to go.
Well, Casey, thank you so much for all of your time today. Like I said, you are inspiring a generation of younger people in the community. So once again, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to Casey Mcquisten, New York Times bestselling author. That brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to our speakers and to all of you attendees joining us for this discussion. For those of you who missed any of the conversations, not to worry, we will have a video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Julia Manchester. Have a great day and be well.